Hi, I'm Grandin Gill. I'm a professor at the University of South Florida and the president of the Informing Science Institute. This series of presentations is intended for individuals who are in the early stages of paper writing, or perhaps have been researchers for a long time but have not written a lot of papers. And it is designed to provide a rather formulaic approach to writing research papers. It is based on a series of presentations given at the Insight Conference in 2019, located in Jerusalem. And if you have questions that you'd like to contact me about, feel free to use my email at grandin@usf.edu. Again, that is Grandin, Grandon, @usf.edu. This presentation is the first in a three-part series, and its focus is on the things that you want to think about as you are preparing to write a paper. In the second part of the series, what we will do is we will look at the different sections of a sort of generic paper and what you might want to put into them. And the approach that I use, I refer to as the LIFO, last in, first out approach. And it's a very formulaic approach to writing a paper. If you're an experienced paper writer, chances are you're going to vary a lot from this. But if you're just getting started, this is a pretty good way to construct a paper that will make it through the review process. Finally, in the third part, we will actually have 6 separate presentations, each of which looks at a different paper structure: empirical research, research involving case studies, design science research, conceptual research, and look at how we would vary from the generic organization for each type of paper. So now we will focus on preparing to write a paper. So preparing to write a paper is typically done hand in glove with preparing to conduct the research. And the earlier you think about where your research is going to go, the better. And the first thing that we'll talk about in this presentation is choosing the audience for your research. And very often research will have multiple audiences, and that often suggests that multiple papers may be written. The next thing we'll look at is the development of good research questions. Now, this is not intended to be a substitute for research methodology, so I'll just quickly talk about some of the things that I would look at in a research question if I were acting as a reviewer. Next thing we'll talk about is choosing an appropriate design. Again, this is something that you would do as part of your research, but it's also important to think about how it's going to play in the papers that you write from that research. We'll then look at identifying what specific contribution you want your research to make. More specifically, what contribution you want your paper to make. Because, as I have indicated, on many occasions you will create multiple papers dealing with the same research. And there's nothing wrong with that, because different audiences and different contributions require different papers. Finally, we'll talk about choosing a research outlet. Since this presentation is being done from a social science perspective, there are normally 3 distinct audiences that you might target for any given paper. The first of these is the academic audience, the research community. And even within that community, you might be targeting disciplinary researchers within your discipline, interdisciplinary researchers that could apply across the spectrum of disciplines, typically within your area. And you could be dealing with methodological researchers, because a lot of times when you publish a paper, one of the things that is going to be of greatest interest to the reader is the methodology you use to conduct your research. But all of these tend to fall into the academic community. Now, another community that you might potentially be writing your paper for is the community of practice. If you're in a business school like I am, this might mean that you're writing for managers, or you might be writing for the consultants who provide advice for managers. Obviously, if you were working in a school of public administration, you might be dealing with legislators and other types of practicing individuals. The point is, the practice audience is a different audience from the academic audience. They're going to look at different outlets. They're going to expect research to be presented in different ways. And before you start to type out a paper, you have to decide which audience you're going to target. And if you're trying to target multiple audiences, you should consider multiple papers. Now, a final audience that could easily be dealing with is the educational audience. This is the instructors who might incorporate your research into a class, or it is the instructors who are looking at your scholarship of teaching research and looking at your findings to see how they might improve their own class. Again, the education audience is probably more like the practice audience than the academic audiences, because they're going to be interested in actually applying your findings in many cases, whereas the academic audience is mainly interested in how your findings will contribute to the literature. The big thing is, make sure you decide who your audience is before you write a particular version of your paper, because if you mismatch the audience, you're not going to get it published. Another critical element of writing a good paper is how you express your research questions. Now, in some cases, you may have already done your research and you're backfitting the questions to the research you've done. In some cases, this will be part of the research design process, which is usually better. Generally, the earlier you get your research questions framed, the better your research is likely to come out. The thing is, there are a lot of characteristics that help determine whether a research question is a good fit with a paper. So some of the things that I look at when I'm looking at research questions include, are the questions interesting? And so elements that make a question interesting might include they appeal to the audience. If you're dealing with a very subtle methodological question, that's not a good fit with a practicing manager audience. Similarly, sort of general results that might apply to a practicing manager or might not apply are the type of thing a practicing manager might want to look at, whereas a researcher would say, well, no, wait a second, this domain is much broader. The answer to this question is it depends. And so ultimately, you need to decide on what is going to be interesting to your audience. If you're dealing with a researcher audience, it's important that whatever your research does builds on a body of research. So you'll normally have a literature review section that will cover that. And what makes things really interesting, and here I'm referring back to a paper written by Davis in 1971, is making incremental contributions to the body of knowledge. And ideally, these questions should not seem obvious. And one way of determining if a question seems obvious or not is negate it and see if anyone would be interested in the answer to that question. So if your question is, do motivated employees employ better? If you do the reverse, something like, why don't motivated employees perform better? Well, people are going to disagree with that question right from the outset. So you probably need to choose a question that's a little bit more likely to generate interesting results. Now, another thing that you want is a question that's answerable. I spend a lot of time assessing proposals for research within the doctoral program that I run. And a lot of times people frame questions that could not be answered. Now, an answerable question is likely to have a single answer. So if you begin a question with what is the best, chances are, unless you've got an optimizing procedure built into your research, you're not going to be able to answer that question. Another type of question that is generally impossible to answer is a question, what is the world going to be like 5 years from now? Now, there are ways of getting around that. For example, if you want to know what the world is going to be like in 5 years from now, you can't answer that question directly, but you could go out and research what experts think the world will look like in 5 years from now. And so by changing the question to what will the world look like in 5 years from now to what do experts think the world will look like in 5 years from now, you get something that you can answer, and as a bonus, it suggests a research method, which I'll talk about later. You want to be able to visualize possible answers. If you ask a research question and you can't even imagine what the answers would look like, chances are you're going to have a heck of a time researching that question, and in all likelihood, the people you interview and the research is going to produce the same type of confusion. You also have a relationship between research objectives and research questions. So a research question normally comes out of a research objective, but the research objective can be more general. For example, you might have a research objective to better understand motivation in the context of factory employees, but then your research question might involve looking at employees within a specific industry, and that once again would feed the methodology. And of course, that's the last thing that a good research question does, is it suggests a methodology. One of the easiest ways to discard a paper is to have a question which the method simply is not going to address. And even if the method is a sound method, if you don't address the research question you pose, it's going to be very easy for a reviewer to reject your paper just on that basis. So one of the things that you can do is look at different methods. There are qualitative empirical methods, there are quantitative empirical methods, there are conceptual methods, there's a new area of research, design science research, which has its own methods. And ideally, the research questions you pose should suggest the method. And I'll talk a little bit more about design science research later because it's kind of a special case. Once again, this presentation is not intended to be a substitute for a research methods course, so I'm not going to go very deep into the research methods. What I'm mainly going to talk about is some of the things that I would look for if I were acting as a reviewer or an editor of a paper that had just been submitted. So there's a whole variety of research methods that fall under the heading of qualitative research methods. These methods tend to be very good with processes where you're trying to capture insights about a particular organizational situation or informing situation or educational situation, whatever the specific context of the research is. In terms of theory, because if you're targeting the academic research audience, you're always going to have some theory in your case. And I will not go into a great deal of detail as to what constitutes theory because nobody can agree on it. But you're going to have something that looks like theory to your reviewer if you want to get this paper through the process. And qualitative research tends to be good at theory qualifications, determining the boundaries of a particular theory and theory expansion, getting insights that were not available previously. There are also specific theory building methods like grounded theory that you can attach your paper to that fall into the qualitative domain. Now, quantitative research nearly always requires the creation and testing of hypotheses. Qualitative research sometimes has hypotheses, but a lot of times the research question is enough for qualitative research. Quantitative research, you're almost always going to do some sort of hypothesis testing. Quantitative research is particularly good for theory testing. whether it be through surveys or through analysis of databases or that sort of thing. And there are some techniques, such as structural equation modeling, which can be used to actually create broader models that look more like theory development. Now, another area of research I would call conceptual research. Now, in conceptual research, what you're doing is you're not going out and gathering data, but you're trying to build theory or qualify theory based upon reasoning systems. And two of the most common reasoning systems are logic and mathematics. As a result, conceptual research can be particularly strong in building internal validity, in other words, consistency between the constructs that you're using, and is often used for theory building. Finally, as I mentioned, there's this new area of research known as design science research. And in design science research, the focus is on creating an artifact. So the artifact, not necessarily a paper, but an artifact, whether it be a new device or a new organizational chart or a new way of assessing employees. I mean, whatever your artifact is, design science research looks at the process of building an effective artifact, making it more useful. And design science research also expects you to make contributions to our better understanding of design. So design science research is one of those areas where you normally have two contributions. There's the contribution made by the artifact, and there are the insights that we learn about design. And what I have found looking at design science research is it doesn't typically respond very well to hypotheses, and a lot of times not even to research questions. On the other hand, it's a good fit with the research objective. My objective is to build a better mousetrap. There's really no need to frame questions like, can design science research help me build a better mousetrap? Though that's the type of question we often see in design science papers, and then they can turn that into a hypothesis. H1, through design science research, we can build a better mousetrap, and then we have to test that hypothesis. And that's all very, very artificial. A lot of times it's just okay to have good research objectives and good insights. Just as choosing your audience is something we don't always think about, choosing the contribution you want to make in a specific paper is also something that warrants some thought before you even start developing the paper. And there are a lot of different ways a paper can contribute. The most obvious way is through the findings. But even in the case of findings, there are two possible communities, maybe three possible communities findings might contribute to. There's findings that contribute to the research audience, to the practice audience, and then potentially to the education audience. Now, in the case of the research audience, at least within the social sciences, the findings will need to make a specific contribution to the body of theory. So that's going to require writing the paper in a particular way. If you're dealing with a practice audience, the findings are likely to be something that the practitioner wants to put into action. So the findings are actually targeting impact on practice. And of course, in the education area, the findings could either impact the curriculum or they could impact how the instruction is conducted. If your paper is focused on the findings, if you're dealing about the impact on practice, then chances are the academic community is not going to be that interested unless you can also show impact on theory. Meanwhile, the practice community may not care that much about the impact on theory, but they're going to be very interested if it can help them run their organization better. Now, findings are not the only thing that we can contribute. Another type of contribution is methodology. If you've got a very interesting research method that you used, in many cases, the research community is going to be more interested in how you conducted this research and how you got it published, because that's a major objective for them. That's going to require a somewhat different paper design than one that's focused on contributing through the findings. A methodology paper would mainly focus on, well, how did we do this, and how did we ensure rigor, and how did we get it through the review process by demonstrating the validity and reliability of the research that we conducted. And other researchers would use a methodology paper as a tool for designing their own papers. But it doesn't end there. You can have a synthesis paper. Many of your conceptual papers take ideas from different fields and blend them together in a new way. So this could be a contribution for theory, but it could also help synthesize ideas for practice. But here, the idea is not that you're getting new findings or that you're introducing a new methodology. Here, you're basically tying together ideas in a way that is different from the way they've been tied before. Then you can also have a translation contribution. So, for example, if you do a literature review of the academic research literature, but frame it in a way that focuses on its applicability to practice, then what you are trying to do is translate the research from one domain to another. The same might apply in interdisciplinary research if you're taking research from one discipline and trying to frame it as being applicable to another discipline. Again, a perfectly valid contribution. And then finally, we have what I will call the creation contribution, where you come up with an entirely new idea and frame it. These things are very, very hard to publish, but nevertheless, some very important research in the past has simply come up with a new way of looking at the world. And creation and synthesis tend to work hand in hand, but I've listed these contributions separately here. The final stage of the paper creation, which often may be the first thing that you should actually look at, is selecting the outlet for your paper. And there are a number of different criteria that you need to use to select an outlet. One is the topic. And what you need here is to look at a paper and see if any of the prior publications of that journal fit the paper's theme. Some journals have preferred methodology. For example, the Academy of Management Review will only publish theory pieces. They don't publish empirical research. Don't waste your time by submitting to a journal that doesn't publish the type of research you're doing. And then also look at the mission, because even if there's not prior research, if your paper topic has a good fit with the journal mission, then you can probably frame the paper that way. Now, another thing that you want to look at is the sort of professional contribution of the paper, which is to say, what does it do for your career? And before you submit to a particular outlet, you want to look carefully at this. You want to look at the ranking of the outlet, what indexes the paper is, the outlet is included in. For example, some universities only look at papers that are in the Thomson ISI Web of Science or in Scopus or in Clavell's. And so you want to make sure you've met the proper indexes. And there are some countries that will not compensate you for research if it's not in the proper indexes. You also might want to look at the editorial board, because sometimes with new journals, they're not in the indexes, but by looking at the editorial board, you can see that there are a lot of well-known researchers who are basically agreeing to help bring this journal from infancy to maturity, and you could make an argument that that's a good fit. You should also look at red flags. Be very careful about journals that are listed as predatory journals. Now, it used to be that there was a well-established list, Bell's list of predatory journals, which everybody used, but that list got taken down because of all the legal implications. Determining whether a journal is predatory or not is a lot harder than it sounds, and it deals with a whole bunch of things. The quality of the reviews, what fees the journal charges for publication, what fees they charge for submission. Are they attempting to create confusion with existing journals? All of these things could lead a journal to be considered predatory, and you do not want to publish your article there because it will come back to bite you at some point in the future. Another thing you want to look at is the audience. If you are hoping to make an important contribution to practice, then one of the best ways to bury that is to put it in a top disciplinary research journal, because almost no one in practice ever encounters those things. It's probably better to submit to one of those journals for your contribution to theory and then write an entirely different article dealing with your research that looks at potential impact on practice, and try to put that somewhere, even in a trade magazine where practice is more likely to encounter it. Also, even if practice doesn't read journals, if you can get your article published in some sort of journal that's focused on practice, you could use that, for example, as a way to build a consulting practice. Remember that when you look at your audience, you might be looking at a disciplinary audience, an interdisciplinary audience, a practice audience, or possibly an educator audience. And you want to write your paper so that it is appropriate for that particular audience. And you want to choose an outlet that obviously is appropriate for that type of journal audience. For example, the Informing Science Informing Science Institute has a whole series of journals, such as the Journal of IT Education Research, that is specifically focused on educational audiences. Finally, you want to look at some practical considerations. You want to consider things like, what's the acceptance rate? Am I going to waste 6 months of my time or 3 years of my time on a paper that gets revised but never actually gets it through acceptance? Now, one thing you got to be a little cautious about in acceptance rates is that for the most part, they are not very reliable measures. If you've got an open access journal, for example, you may find a substantial amount of your submissions could be ads for Viagra that some web crawler managed to find out how to submit. And the thing is, those get counted as part of the acceptance rate. So an acceptance rate of 10% could mean that 9 out of 10 valid submissions are not accepted for publication, or it could mean that the journal doesn't have very good firewalls, and a lot of stuff that should be eliminated managed to get through and act as submissions. The Informing Science Institute has got a very nice review system, and the problems that they used to have 10 years ago with random submissions were relatively less common now. Having said that, however, we still get a lot of submissions that are entirely inappropriate for the journal, and what that suggests is someone is basically using a shotgun approach and submitting to a bunch of journals at the same time, which is a violation of research ethics, but is accounts for part of the rejection rate. Finally, you want to take a look at the fees, and the fees. First off, you don't want to pay money that you don't have to, but the other thing is the fees will often provide an indicator that a journal is on the edge of being predatory. If a journal succeeds only because it charges very high fees for publication, then that is not a good indicator. So you might want to take a look at places like Google Scholar and Harzing's Publisher Parish, which is a downloadable software, and just see what else has been published in the journal. Because if the journal has very, very low citation rates and the fees are very high, there's a good chance it's a predatory journal. Well, that concludes this presentation on preparing to publish. The next presentation in the series will look at the different sections of a generic paper, and the final part consists of a series of different paper structures attempting to accomplish different things. Once again, if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me at grandon@usf.edu. That is GRANDON @usf.edu. Thank you very much.